Before we get to objectives 6 and 7, you're going to notice that they are both about reading comprehension, and objective 6 is going to focus on reading comprehension in terms of narrative texts, and objective 7 is going to focus on reading comprehension in terms of informational texts. However, there is a lot of similarities and overlap between the way that reading comprehension works, and there are a couple things that are unique to informational and narrative texts. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to talk about reading comprehension broadly for this chunk, and this is going to serve as information that's going to be applicable to both Objective 6 and Objective 7. So we're just going to talk about reading comprehension in general, and everything I say in this section is going to work for both. The next video is going to come back to the objectives and talk about where things will be different for each objective. So here we go, reading comprehension. As I've been hinting in previous sections of the webinar, reading comprehension is the goal. Okay, that's the reason we were doing all of that work in phonics and phonemic awareness is because ultimately we need comprehension. Comprehension is reading for understanding. This is a great quote that sums up what I've been preaching previously. Comprehension is the reason for reading. Research over 30 years has shown that instruction and comprehension can help students understand what they read, remember what they read, and communicate with others about what they read. And that is the intrinsic value of learning to read. So that's why we always have the eye on the prize here, and we save talking about comprehensions for sort of this really big point that everything's been leading up to. So again, what we're now finally talking about is the end of the rope, okay? We've had all these things that we've been talking about in language comprehension. Okay, we talked about background knowledge and vocabulary. We touched a little bit on sentence structure and language structure, and print concepts, and a little bit on verbal reasoning. And we did a lot of time on all these word recognition skills. We've talked about all of these things, and they all come together for skilled reading. And skilled reading is synonymous with reading comprehension or text comprehension, right? When you have successfully read, we define that by saying that you understood what you read and could read it fluently. Okay. So how do we figure out how to teach students skills to become better? Let's say they are fluent readers and they are, they can decode very quickly and they have some vocabulary, but they're not quite putting it together at the end. So there's been some research that examines, okay, what are the things that good readers do? So some of the ways that we have come up with ideas on how to teach reading comprehension better is by very closely examining what the very strong readers do and working backwards to try to teach those things explicitly to students. So here is just an example, a list of some things that when you look at really good readers and you ask them about what they're thinking about while they're reading, this is what we see them doing. We see them use strategies, sometimes before, sometimes during, sometimes after, to help them understand. We see they are actively paying attention to the text, so they're not distracted by other things. We see that they have a goal for reading. That means they go into reading with a purpose. That purpose might be, I want to understand this, or I'm looking for this certain piece of information, right? Good readers approach the text looking for something. Good readers also tend to preview the text. They'll flip through. This is especially important for informational texts. They'll preview the text and they'll note the structure, the headings, etc. They'll apply strategies where appropriate. Some strategies are appropriate for some kinds of texts. Other strategies are appropriate for others. They'll constantly be monitoring themselves and asking themselves questions about what they read. The most important question is, does that make sense? Right? They're constantly checking in with themselves. Does that make sense? Does that make sense? Do I need to reread that again? Um, they come back, they revise, they question what they've read. They're also good at integrating their prior knowledge, making connections between things that they've previously read and what they're currently reading. They can even think beyond the text and think about what authors view and context, and then even the bias of the author and the way they present certain subjects, right? They monitor their own understanding, and then at the end, they can evaluate the text's quality and value in like a book review or something, right? So that's all the things that good readers do. Okay, it's a lot of things that we notice in good readers. So what do we teach? Well, we've picked out a bunch of these things and we've tried to distill the research into a series of evidence-based practices that when you explicitly teach students to do this and then track them doing these strategies, um, it will improve their comprehension for at least a time. So here are these evidence-based strategies that the MTEL is going to be asking you about in regards to reading comprehension. Answering questions, right? We will embed questions within the text, and we will have students either try to answer those questions, or we will have students generate their own questions about the text, right? They will go through the text, as you'll see in a question in a minute. They can go through the text and use a post-it notes to write themselves questions like, I didn't understand that, or what is that about? Or I'm wondering if dot dot dot. Um, those are questions that we can have students, and if students are pausing to do that, they are more likely to be attending to the text and paying attention. Similarly, instead of asking a question, we can have students try to make predictions. This is a powerful thing we do to help students. Um, Look at the title and make a prediction about what this is going to be about. Right? Look at this subheading, make a prediction about what this paragraph is going to be about, right? All of that stuff is helping students attend to the text more by stepping outside of it, right? And that's why we call these strategies, and I wouldn't use this term uh, if not for the MTEL also using the term, you'll see that MTEL will call these metacognitive strategies. And simply what we mean by that is it's a strategy that we have the student do that is not about the reading itself. And what I mean by that is like in contrast, let's take like a decoding strategy, right? If I have a student, if I give them a rule, a phonics rule, and they come upon a word they don't know in text, applying that rule, having the student think about that rule and applying it to decoding that, um, that is not metacognitive. That is still attending to the actual text and attending to the words that the student. So the student isn't paying attention or thinking about anything else while they're applying those in-text decoding strategies. These are different. These are metacognitive. They are outside. So when I am having the student answer questions or make a prediction, I am having the student stop paying attention to the text momentarily, right? And so this can be a gamble for some students, but just assume that for the purposes of the MTEL, we want to be recommending that students do these things, and these are all evidence-based strategies. But just know that these are called metacognitive because the student, when they are making a prediction, they're no longer reading, right? When they're doing a decoding strategy, they're still reading. When they're making a prediction or answering a question, they're not reading anymore. They're doing something else. And the idea is that these things that we're asking them to do that are no longer reading are so powerful that when they go back to reading, it's going to help them comprehend more. And as I said, evidence suggests that at least these things that I'm going to share with you are such powerful things that they do in fact help students understand better had they not done them. but they are not reading, right? These are we're not asking the students um, to attend to the text while we're doing these things. This is the rare kind of strategies that I'm going to have you where I'm saying, don't pay attention to the text. They have to pay attention to this other thing. All right, we did answering questions, making predictions, comprehension monitoring. This is, like I said before, where students are checking with themselves, did I understand that? Now, you can help students do this in a lot of ways. You can insert little like tabs or something in the pages to help the student know, hey, I got to stop here and check. Because a lot of times, especially once the students are, reading for understanding in third grade and beyond, they're going to be doing a lot of reading independently, and a lot of that reading is going to be silent. So, how do you monitor the understanding of reading um, every day if you are not hearing the student read aloud to you as much anymore? You still want to do that. Well, one of the ways you do that is you set up um, self-monitoring systems that the students can follow so that they start to take more control and more ownership of whether they're understanding something. And then if they're not understanding something, they can come um, ask you a question about it, right? Next is summarizing. When students get to the end of a text, we want them to practice summing up what they've read and getting the main idea or getting the gist, you might hear. And also, along with those main ideas, coming up with the details as well. Um, so summarizing at the end of a text kind of puts all of this together, right? If you are able to successfully summarize what you have just read after reading it, that tells me that you were probably successfully comprehension monitoring and you were understanding as you read because you could put it all together at the end. That's the hardest thing to do and will often require quite a bit of explicit instruction on how to do that. Um, Last is the generating questions. This is actually, I think I went over this when I was talking about answering questions, right? Answering questions is when you pose the question and the student answers it. They come out of the text to answer the question. Generating questions is when the students obviously come up with the questions on their own and direct them hypothetically or towards a peer. So these are, I would say, 5 evidence-based reading comprehension, metacognitive reading comprehension strategies that I want you to have in your pocket as you move through the MTEL. You should know that these 5 are good, and if you see these showing up in questions, we can endorse them. Okay, so how do we now? These are the 5 like behaviors that we want students to do. Now the question is, how do you teach students to get to do those behaviors? Well, one, you teach the evidence-based strategies, meaning you model it for the student, right? You take those 5 things that we just talked about, and you model what it's like to generate questions. And then you do some guided practice on helping students generate questions. And then you let them independently generate their own questions and check whether they're generating questions that are, when they do independent question generating, that they're relevant to the text. You're also going to be using graphic organizers. This is very helpful when you're asking students to summarize things at the end. You can have students, as they're reading, fill out graphic organizers that are tailored to the structure of the text. Of course, graphic organizers can be very different um, based on the kind of text that you're reading, which graphic organizer is most appropriate. But filling a graphic organizer out and then writing a summary based on the information in the graphic organizer is definitely a practice that's going to help support that summarizing behavior. Engaging in high quality discussions, right? And especially this is especially good for predictions and questions, and all of them really, summarizing as well. So having students talk with each other and talk with you to draw conclusions and inferences, and all of those things, that is a way that you can having those high quality discussions where you're prompting students to do those metacognitive strategy behaviors, is how you would teach that. Fourth, you're going to encourage these by selecting text purposefully. As I've been saying, certain texts more lend themselves to certain kinds of strategies and behaviors, and other texts don't as much, right? If you're reading an informational text, predictions are may be less valuable than if you're reading narrative text where you really want the student to be like you're using making predictions as an engagement strategy because I don't know what's going to happen in the story. What's going to happen? I want to make a prediction, and the student reads, and did it come true or did it not come true? Oh my God, it came true. This is so exciting. It becomes a part of engagement if you do that, right? Um, Informational text, it's not so exciting if your prediction comes through because you're probably basing it off a heading or something, and you're probably going to be right. Um, so we can see how, depending on the genre, we have to be selecting the text um, with the strategies that we're going to use in mind, right? And especially if the goal of the objective of the lesson is not necessarily to learn the content of the text, it is to practice implementing a strategy. Well, then, of course, selecting the text that matches that strategy is crucial, right? Um, and overall, this is always true, engaging and motivating contexts, right? It's very hard if you're asking the student to spend more mental energy implementing a comprehension strategy than they would have if they were just reading it straight. Um, you're asking them to do something that's harder than they would be doing otherwise. So, meeting them where they're at by providing them content that they find already engaging and motivating, it can be very helpful to practice those metacognitive strategies, right? Of course, students have to read things that they don't want to read at times, but if your objective is to teach the skill of summarizing, lowering um, the aversiveness of the the text by making it more choosing something that's very engaging to the student is going to make it more likely that they get quality practice on implementing the strategy. All right, let's just go through a couple. I just have a smattering here in case we want a little bit more explanation. Of course, all of these strategies and ways to teach the strategies, they have, there's much, much more to say about them. But I'm just trying to give you a little bit more in the event that maybe you use um, something like answering generating questions as a strategy you want to use in the essay, in which case you might need a sentence or two about it more. So here's a sentence or two about it. You can use what's called the stoplight system, where um, you know, you can organize your questions in green light, yellow light questions, or red light questions. So a green light question, also known as a right there question, means that readers can go right to the text to answer the green light question. The answer is in one single place. So students, you can be posing the question to the student, or student can be generating questions. The green would be right there. Yellow lights are here and there, where students need to slow down. They need to think about it. They need to maybe make a connection between this and something else in the text to answer the question. And then not there questions are where students need to stop and really think um, and probably make a connection to something that's outside of the text. Yellow is like text to text connection. Red light questions would be like a text to self or a text to word connection where we want the students to read something and then do some sort of reflection about something that was not necessarily in the text. Right? Another example of self-monitoring is click and clunk. This is a thing that we have students do. You'll see this where students are doing some independent silent reading. Um, and students might be displaying green or red cards on their desk that display. So if I'm showing a green card, that means everything's clicking, I'm understanding. If I'm displaying a red card on my desk, that means I'm clunking, that everything stopped, and I'm either trying to implement strategies like rereading and solving and thinking about it, and I have a process that I go through for clunk. Of course, there's a lot more to this than just this little that I'm showing you. Um, but I can use click and clunk as an example of a self-monitoring, an evidence-based self-monitoring strategy. So, as I said before, when I talked about summarizing is something that for many, many students needs to be explicitly taught. So, a lot of this comprehension monitoring stuff is will support all students, and really needs to be explicitly taught to students that are struggling to read. Summarizing, I would say, is such a difficult skill for all students that you will need to teach virtually everybody explicitly how to summarize. So you're going to have teaching the main idea, right? Identifying details, identifying connections between details, using a graphic organizer to help create hierarchies between details and ideas. Um, in paragraphs, in multiple paragraphs, in words, etc. You're going to need to do a lot of modeling of summarizing. But again, summarizing is often the best evidence that we have that students were successfully comprehending the text. Here's another example of explicitly teaching summarizing. So here's a seven-step process you can take a look at, and a summary template and a reference to the Keys to Literacy website that will have more information about this. All right, let's organize these into reading strategies. And I like to think about them in terms of time. What do I do before? What am I having the student do before? What am I having the student doing during? And what do I have the student doing after, right? So here are these strategies that we've talked about kind of matched to when they happen. So before reading strategies, this is setting a purpose. Like I said, that evidence-based strategy of, good readers know uh, why they are reading something and what they are looking for. So a before reading strategy for a student might be to have them set their purpose. Preparing the text with questions and connections to help keep the student engaged. Making a prediction is obviously a strategy that has to happen before you read. Pre-teaching vocabulary, we talked about in the vocabulary section. Making things clear about their links to background knowledge. Like if you have an understanding of what students know and are bringing to the table about the text, you can make that clear before reading. And of course, we'll talk about this when we do narrative informational text, but for that text, explicitly teaching the text features and structures ahead of time, before the students begin to read, are all very powerful things that are likely to increase engagement. During reading, we're going to be having students doing that self-monitoring, making their thinking visible, right? Providing guiding questions embedded in the reading using post-it notes or using something else. Um, we can have students do summarizing, not just the whole text at the end, but we can have them do what's called paragraph shrinking, where they take each paragraph and they get that paragraph down to a sentence. So then they have summaries of paragraphs. And then they can, when they need to reread to put the whole thing together, instead of trying to hold all of the information at once, they're just pulling together a series of sentences that each then summarize each paragraph. So it's less information to try to synthesize into a full summary. So having students during reading do that paragraph shrinking is very powerful. During reading, students will revisit those predictions to see if they were right. Having students use a graphic organizer to sequence the events, especially in a narrative text, would be very important. And then for the informational texts, going back and locating evidence for the claims, right? So if there's a claim, we want to see where in the text the evidence is backing that claim up. After reading, when you're all done with the reading, you're going to be asking different kinds of questions about, wondering about the future or wondering what's going to happen next, generating questions from the text, reflect on the final stance of your predictions. Were they right? Were they wrong? Doing the total summarizing. And then when you're making claims or opinions about the text, finding those evidence as a nice after reading strategy as well. All right, let's do some questions that aren't genre dependent. This is just on those metacognitive reading strategies that we've been talking about for this video. So number 63, go ahead and pause here. Okay, the correct answer is B, metacognitive awareness while reading. So we can see that the teacher in this question is employing multiple metacognitive strategies that are taking place during reading. We see asking questions, um, looking up words, making predictions. Those are all things that are during reading metacognitive strategies, right? So the answer in this case would be B. That's what the teacher's trying to have them do is raise the metacognitive awareness. Um, A, C, and D are not relevant to the thing that the student's asking them to do because, well, silent reading fluency, reading enjoyment, concentrate during reading, none of those are metacognitive, right? Those are all attending still to the text, and what the teacher's asking them to do are clearly metacognitive behaviors. So 77. Pause here. The correct answer is B. Each student applied different reading comprehension skills while reading the text. All right, so let's go through this one carefully because I think this is a good question that teaches us a lot. So we have this first student, and they are really good at remembering the details from the chapter, but they have difficulty um, getting the gist. And I said that what I mean is that the gist is another word for getting the summary, getting the whole understanding of the chapter. So they get details, but they're missing the main idea. The second student can get the main idea, the summary, but has difficulty remembering specific facts. So, which of the following best explains the most likely reason for the student's varied understanding? Right. So, we have A, the first student is more proficient at using metacognitive strategies to make sense of the text. Well, we can't say that because they both are making sense of the text, but they're just pulling away different things. Um, C, the second student's more proficient at literal. This question has nothing to do with inference. The inference is irrelevant to whether they're getting details versus main ideas. That's really the comparison here is details versus main ideas. And then D, each student brought a unique set of prior experiences. Of course, all students bring a unique set of prior experiences. That's um, true, but irrelevant to the question. The question is what is explaining the difference? And it sounds to me like we can um, make an inference that the students applied different strategies. One student was focused on summarizing and getting the gist and the main idea, and the other student was really focused on taking notes and filling out a graphic organizer of details. So they each were attending to a different thing during the text, during reading, and that's best reflected by answer B. Number 73. Pause here. The correct answer is B, providing explicit instruction on how to identify the most important points and key details. All right. So we have a third grade teacher. They're having students read in articles from children's magazine. That's irrelevant information about blah, blah, blah. That's irrelevant information. So we have the teacher reading multiple articles. That's what's important. Okay, so what happens? After they read the articles, they're going to work in small groups to use a graphic organizer, comparing and contrasting the solutions. So, how do we help the students integrate information across those texts? Which would be most essential, right? So if the goal of them of taking these different articles and comparing and contrasting the information, the thing we want to do is explicitly teach how to get those points and those main points, those main ideas, get the gist, and get the key details so that they can then put them in that graphic organizer and make that comparison. If students are unable to do that summarizing behavior, they are not going to be able to do that next step, that harder step of comparing and contrasting them. So if I'm going to have students work on the ultimate goal is comparing and contrasting, they first need to be able to get this information. So to make sure they can do that, I need to explicitly instruct that, right? So all of these other things are not relevant to the question. A is lovely, but is not relevant to helping them specifically with that objective. C is irrelevant. While students can share personal experiences, that's not relevant to helping them understand. Although it's a thing you'll see as a frequent response to questions like this, scenarios like this in the classroom. And D, providing explicit instruction in discipline-specific conventions of writing. Now, I have told you before, as has come up in a bunch of questions now, you should have your eyes open for explicit instruction. And here we have two answers with providing explicit instruction. So if you see that, that should be like, okay, it's got to be one of these two. It's got to be either B or D, right? And so only B is going to be the answer that directly addresses the objective of comparing and contrasting. And while you may well provide explicit instruction in specific conventions of scientific writing, that would be for a different writing objective, right? The goal would be different. So only B actually matches with the students, what we want the students to be doing. In the next video, we'll pick up objectives 6 and 7 together and talk about the differences in how we approach literary/narrative versus informational texts.